In Philippians chapter 1, we're going to look at verse 27 through the end of the chapter, verse 30 tonight. So if you turn over there, we'll get to it in just a moment. Don't forget that in 2 weeks, all of our senior saints, and as I mentioned, that we're not putting an age on that. If you suspect that you might be a senior saint, then you are. And we'd love to have you come to an open house at our home. We'll have the address in the bulletin coming up, and we'll just enjoy. It's a come and go affair. You can come and stay the whole 2 hours, or you can come and stay for 11 minutes. Either way, it's fine. Just come and go for a couple hours between 2 and 4, 2 weeks from today on October the 2nd. And then don't forget, have you been making your list and checking it twice? For our first Friends Day coming up in 2 months on November the 13th, we're going to have 3 services that day. And what a crowd. Who knows what we'll have? Maybe 3 services won't contain it. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing as we share our family with others? It was the summer between my graduation from high school and my first year in college, and I was looking for work. I've not really had very many real jobs. I've been preaching full-time since I was 20. Okay, so that's the lack of calluses or because of that. Well, I'd worked a little bit at Orange Julius. Yeah, I delivered pizzas a little bit, worked at a gas station. But then that summer, a member of the church where my dad preached was the director of a nursing home, and they needed some landscaping work done. That sounded like a good job for a young man. It was steady pay, 8 hours a day, all summer long. And so I went quite excited. The pay was good. I think he was paying me $5 an hour instead of $3.35 an hour, which was minimum wage at the time. So I went and was excited about my summer job. And I got there and he said, the main thing you need to do is distribute mulch in all the flower beds. To which I said, oh, no problem. And then he took me to the mulch pile. I'm sorry, did I say mulch pile? He took me to the mulch mountain. He took me to the mammoth, a Mount Rainier of mulch that had been dumped in the parking lot. And she said, yeah, but, we'll have more rock coming a little bit later, but if you could get this distributed by the end of the week, then we'll have you more to do next week. I was speechless. They had a little wheelbarrow thing for me to move it around in and a shovel. And so I started in shoveling a mountain of mulch. About 4 days in, I was starting to make a little bit of progress. And I went and I spent a couple hours distributing the mulch and things that I'd wheeled over there. I went back to the mulch pile, and somehow the mulch truck had come in the time that I'd went and worked, and it was a bigger mountain than when I'd started. I was quite discouraged. I know I didn't do as good a job as I should have that summer. But honestly, I was discouraged. Have you ever faced a task that was so big you didn't think you could complete it? That it was unworkable, that it had no end in sight. It was a mountain that couldn't be scaled. It was a problem that couldn't be solved. Have you ever faced something like that in your life? And then no matter how hard you work at it, it just seems to become a bigger mountain of mulch. No matter how much effort you put in. Well, as I read this text tonight, I think about some of the ways that Christianity I've heard it presented in my life. Particularly the legalistic brand of our faith that follows in the vein of that old Puritan sermon, sinners in the hands of an angry God. Did anybody study that in literature class? Remember that? And although we've never used that terminology in the Lord's church, and really since the Puritan times, it's been the actual title of our sermons have been ratcheted back a little bit. The content or the idea that Christianity is trying to measure up to a certain standard of living and a certain level of perfection, that when you fall short, God is looking and waiting to punish and to find fault with, is an absolute mountain of mulch that you look at And it fills a person with nothing but discouragement, doesn't it? Particularly if you read passages like the one we have tonight. And the reason I'm sharing this is because depending on what you have in your mind of what it means to serve the Lord and live for Him, this text tonight can either be gloriously encouraging or it can be a never-ending mountain of mulch. Because the Apostle Paul gives instruction that, frankly, is an unscalable peak. He says here, only. You know, that's a word you use when you're like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's just, only do this. He says, only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now rewind with me a little bit. What does the word worthy mean? Well, the only way I know to define that word is the word deserving. Worthy, deserving, honoring. This is a word that we would use if we look at someone who wins the Heisman Trophy. After yesterday, I'm thinking maybe that Louisville quarterback. He's going to win it. I'm not predicting, I'm just maybe. But if he does, you know what they'll say? He was the one who was worthy of the honor. He deserved it. He earned it. He is the only one of whom we could bestow because he's the only one. He's the only one worthy. I mean, isn't that what the word means? And so here we have the Apostle Paul saying only. Just a little thing. Live your lives worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, to understand this text, we not only have to define the word worthy, we have to rewind and define the words gospel of Christ. Well, if we were to ask, we talked about this a little bit this morning, if I were to go and I were to ask you or people out in the street to give me a definition of what's the gospel, you're going to hear a lot of answers. Even in the church, you hear answers that are, well, they're not correct, but they're not completely off base because they are about things that point to the gospel. For instance, you might hear this answer. Well, the gospel's the Bible. Okay? But sometimes we get that impression because we use the terminology, preach the gospel all the time. But to be clear, the gospel's not the Bible. That's not exactly the right answer. Now, the Bible indeed points to the gospel and tells us about the gospel. And without the Bible, we wouldn't know what the gospel is, right? But it's not the full definition of what the gospel is. Some others might say doing the will of God. Well, indeed, doing the will of God is wrapped up with and part of the gospel, but that's not the biblical definition of what the gospel is. The word gospel means good news. But specifically, what is that good news? Well, we mentioned it this morning. When you look over in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 1 through 4, the Apostle Paul defines the gospel. Now, that text would be particularly important for us because it's the same author as here in Philippians chapter 1. So when he says, this is the gospel, and now in our text, he says, live a life worthy of the gospel, we know exactly what he wants us to live worthy of. Correct? So what does Paul define the gospel as? He says, I remind you the gospel that Christ died for your sins, was buried, and was resurrected on the third day. Basically, to sum it up, the gospel, the good news. Now, the Bible tells us about the gospel, and we live lives in relation to and because of the gospel. But the gospel, the good news of Jesus, is that he died, was buried, and resurrected on the third day. Now, that clarifies and terrifies in regard to our text tonight, does it not? Because here's what the Apostle Paul just said. Only, no big deal. Just live lives worthy, deserving of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I don't know about you, but depending on how you look at that, that's a pretty big mountain of mulch, isn't it? How do you scale that height? How do you ever get to the bottom of the pile? How do you ever say mission accomplished? And remember, Paul is writing from a pretty mature perspective. As we've talked about these last few weeks, he's writing from a prison cell where they're all discouraged as they write to him. And he says, oh, it's going to be all right. For me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. And then he turns around and says, only let you live lives worthy of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we look at that, and folks, if we have in our mind that God's expectation of worthy means that I have to live up to that in every way, in every thought, in every action, then it is going to be a terrifying discouragement because I am never going to get it done. How about you? No. So, what other perspective could we take as we look at this text that would help us to understand? Well, one passage that I think is very helpful is another one that uses kind of unique language over in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. In verse 3, Paul, again writing, he says this. He says, for you are still carnal. For where there are envy and strife and divisions among you, are you not carnal and behaving like, and this is interesting language, behaving like mere men? You see, Paul does indicate there that the life that has been influenced and transformed and ransomed by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is a different kind of life than the life lived by everyone else around us. He says, your problem, Corinthians, now they're still the saints. He'll make that very clear in the opening statements of 1 Corinthians, even though he's writing to a church, frankly, that nobody in here would place membership at. Unless you wanted to see a drunken party during the Lord's Supper, okay? And other crazy things. I mean, this church had problems, big time. But he still calls them the saints. But now he's telling them, here's your root problem. And all of these things he'll talk about that they're struggling with when they're have this crazy disorder in their worship. And one man has his father's wife and is living in that sin. And they're suing one another. And all of the difficulties they're having, they're all symptoms of this basic problem. He says, you are living carnal like everybody else. You're living like mere men. And you're not mere men. You're different. Because you have been influenced by and transformed by the gospel. And that transformation is supposed to have an effect in the life that you live. And so when we take that and understand our text tonight through that concept, we realize that this idea of living worthy of the gospel, perhaps it's not literally telling us that we have to live lives that match up in every way deserving of Christ's death. Because if it is, we just as well give up now. But you understand, there are a number of passages in Scripture, there are another number of commandments that are not intended to be fulfilled literally in this life. Do you know that? Jesus gave you some commandments you cannot in fullness fulfill. How about this? Be ye, anybody know where this is going? Perfect as I am perfect. Anybody there yet? Lenore, don't raise your hand. because I know the truth. I mean, when Jesus tells us, be ye perfect as I am perfect, you're not going to make it there. In fact, if you look closely, you'll see a lot of very difficult. Paul, what he's talked about previously in this chapter, about getting to the point where death isn't something that frightens us, but that we look forward to, that we yearn for. Anybody there? How about later on, in the next 2 or 3 verses, he's going to talk about the joy of sharing in his suffering. Are we there? You see, commandments like this are not intended to be a measure of mathematics. You know, how many exact righteous things has this person done? 542, and then 11 unrighteous. Well, that balances out. This is not an arithmetic equation. It's more a question of ethics and principle. It's asking the question, are you living lives striving to live them worthy of the gospel? In other words, are you living lives that are thinking about and focusing upon the gospel in everything you do? Is it the overarching motivation? Not that you'll fulfill it perfectly, but if it is, people have all sorts of overarching motivations as they live their lives. Some people's motivation is they want a better life for their kids than they had for themselves. Have you ever known anybody like that? Is it a powerful motivation? Man, you'll see people work 16 hours a day to give their kids a better life than they had. Spoil them to death, but they were worried about that, so they'll do it. What are some other motivations people have? They'll think about, well, I want to accomplish this in my life. I grew up poor. I'm never going to be poor again. They'll work so they don't have to be. And you'll see people, when they have this overarching motivation that colors everything they do. It influences everything they do. It is a driving motive, foundational, when they make decisions. Do I take this job or do I take this job? Which one's going to help me get to that life purpose? Right? Which one's going to give my kids a better life than I had? Or whatever their life purpose is. I don't think the Apostle Paul is trying to tell us you're a failure if you don't live a life that is deserving of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus in its fullness. Because if he is, then we're just all going to fail. I think he's instructing us to live a life that is lived in reflection of, in the light of, with the overarching purpose of living our life worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. How does that look? Well, that means when I make decisions, rather than thinking, well, I want my kids to have a better life than I did, well, that may be okay too, but it's not the overarching decision. My overarching decision, do I take this job or that job? Believe me, I've done that recently. With this in mind, with this concept in mind. Which one is about the gospel of Jesus Christ? Young people, when you're looking at this young lady or that young lady, and you have an interest in both of them, and they're both just as pretty as a picture, and you're trying to decide which is the right one for you. Maybe the question shouldn't be which one's prettier as a picture than the other. I don't know if I said that right. But maybe that shouldn't be the first concern. Maybe the first concern shouldn't be which one's funnier, or maybe the first concern should be which one helps me to live a life worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Maybe when you choose to enter into this business venture or that business venture, or you choose what entertainment or what hobbies, or you choose what to do with your time, you see there is no end to this question. What does it mean to live a life worthy of the gospel? It means you make your decisions. You color your life based upon the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Well, Paul gives some specifics He says, let your conduct be worthy of the gospel. Whether I come or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand in one spirit, with one mind, striving together with the faith of the gospel. Now you understand, even though he lists a few things, this is not, a total, complete listing. This is simply some of the things, some of the areas where we determine right and wrong, who we're going to be based upon the gospel. But he lists this. He says you stand in unity. He says that you stand fast in one spirit. There is nothing that absolutely mars the gospel of Jesus Christ than when those who have been saved by it think so little of one another and the Lord who loves every one of us that we just trample on and abuse and mistreat one another. That's why I've heard Lenora say it, and my mama used to say it to my sister and I. But any of you mamas ever said to your kids, if you love me, can you just get along? Honestly, I want to see a lifting of hands of mamas who've said something to that effect to your kids, right? I mean, you have. John, you are not a mama. But you've said it, okay. Well, something to the effect of, if you just, the greatest gift, Lenore said it this way, the greatest gift you could give me is just stop fighting for 10 minutes. Can't you just, I love both of you. Can't you just love each other? I mean, you've heard that before, right? Do you know that Miss Lenora would rather those kids, I don't know, do something to her than them not love each other? It's just how every one of you that's a parent, you understand what I mean, don't you? You want your kids to love each other. And you don't understand when they, a lot of kids fuss and fight, we get that. But when your kids can't love each other like you love both of them, it's imperceivable to you. And the greatest gift they could give you at that moment is to get along. Not because they love each other, but because they love you. If brethren could learn that basic principle of life and parenting, the church would please the Lord far better than it does, wouldn't it? If we could just learn to now I know there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of problems sometimes, but if we could just learn the basic principle that unity, the gospel is about that Jesus died for the whole world. Jesus died for every one of us. That you are as important as I am and as Don, every single person, were you the only one on this earth, he would have still died on the cross. Because every one of us have the same worth at the foot of the cross. And for me to treat you like you're less is to dishonor that death, burial, and resurrection. So Paul says, live your lives in unity. That's how you live worthy of the gospel. And then in verse 28, he continues and he says, and not in any way terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that from God. Proof of perdition. You see what he describes there is they lived in a world where there was opposition to the gospel, to the truth, to Christianity. And some Christians were tempted to cower, to slink away in fear. And he says, no. That's the other thing we know about bringing dishonor to someone we love is when you're ashamed of somebody you love. Nothing brings greater dishonor. The kids have always teased me because I tend to be a little funny around their friends and things because I'm a hoot. I am. I don't know why the kids can't see it sometimes, but I tend to be a little funny around their friends. So get rid of that look on your face. But and they'll sometimes be like, "You're just so embarrassing," and that's fine. It's kind of part of the game, I want them to say that. What young people who are just starting off with your kids are little, someday They're going to grow up, they're going to be teenagers, and you're going to get to embarrass them, and it's all worth it. It's all worth it. But you know, that's very different than if I were to overhear one of my children. Somebody says, "Is that your dad?" Yeah. That would hurt. You understand? To be disowned, to be dishonored, to have someone ashamed of who you are. That's what they were struggling with. When they're not willing to stand. And sometimes the greatest expression of love is also the greatest expression of courage. The ability to stand up. We need to hear this message because we're living in a time when we're going to need more and more and more in the future courage and the ability to stand up. And it's hard to do, folks. It's hard. I taught karate for about 10 years. And for years I taught in the church building back in Alabama and opened it up to the community like as an outreach, as a ministry. And I had so many folks who bring their kids into the gymnasium, the Family Life Center there at Sheridan Avenue. And we would go through our karate classes a couple nights a week. And we had some sparring and things. And what I found interesting was inevitably, almost every month, I had some mother who brought their son, and she gave it this context. I want to enroll him in karate because he's being bullied at school. And a lot of times, I would try to explain, I have a very basic philosophy on bullying. Okay, this is my basic philosophy on bullying. Predators attack the weakest prey. Don't be the weakest prey. It's simple. And so, but they would come and I'd say, well, I can help him, but there's going to be a little crying involved, Because he's probably going to get knocked down a few times in the process. There may be a bloody lip once or twice, and he may have a little bit of a black eye. But you need to teach him to go and be proud of that black eye instead of ashamed of it. That's how you deal with this. And sometimes, in fact, probably more often than not, it didn't work. A kid would come and his mom would say, I don't want him to be bullied. And what she really meant was, well, I know what she meant. Because as soon as it got a little bit tough in class, he was gone. And she was gone too. Except for Christopher Romeo. I'll never forget Christopher Romeo. Christopher was being raised by a single mother. He'd never had a daddy in his life. Okay, now she was doing her best, but she was struggling with all this boy stuff. I told him he needed a mouthpiece and an athletic cup. She brought a mouthpiece and she brought a tumbler that had University of Alabama on it. Okay? She was struggling. Now that was an interesting conversation, but that's for another time. So she comes and she brings Christopher and we're going to teach him karate, and he comes in and he goes in he lost every match, and then she enrolls him in the tournament. And I'm like, but you can't say this is not a good idea. She enrolls him in the tournament and he loses. And he loses. And then the last match he's up against Seth. And one thing you don't do if you want to help a kid to be able to face his fears is you don't say, go easy on him. No. That's not good. So I encouraged him. And I'll tell you, to this day, I can still see Christopher Romeo, who gets knocked down. And he's wobbling, and he gets back up, and he's crying, tears running down his face. He's just got kicked in the face. And then it happens again. And yes, Seth, he's a big meanie, so you can talk to him about it afterward. But down he goes again, and he gets back up. This time, he's got a little bit of a bloody lip, tears just streaming down his face, and he's crying. Well, he's getting back up. And I actually said, and I never said this, but I actually said, is that enough, bud? You need to, no. And he went again. It's a 5-point match. Got down to 4-0. He got back up, tears streaming. Seth came in and wham! He hits him. He got one hit in. Then he lost the next round. But it was magnificent valor. It was. Magnificent. Because he realized right then his identity was not about his success. It was about whether or not he was willing to stand. You understand? It was about whether or not he was willing to stand. Regardless of what opposition came. And every time he'd stand back up, he'd cry, and he'd look over at his mama, and it was killing her. I mean, kill her. But he'd look over at his mama as if to say, Mom, I'm not going to let you down. No matter what. And he didn't win the match. But he wasn't a failure. And he tells them there, he says, regardless of opposition, you stand. You stand in love. You stand in kindness. You stand in faith. You stand. And the last few verses, the last verse that he shares is, he says, for to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake, having the same conflict which you saw in me and now hear in me. He says, you're not just there to stand and to win. You're there to stand, and if you suffer, it's an honor. To this day, when I think of the toughest kid I ever trained, my mind goes to several, but it goes to Christopher Romeo. Because he didn't just stand to win. He was willing to stand and suffer. Encourage. What does it mean to live a life worthy of the gospel? Well, it means a lot of things. It doesn't mean perfection. But it does mean living my life in reflection of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And everything I do and everything I am, it is the guiding principle, the light. It means that in things like unity, I'm going to live and treat you in light of the gospel. It means that when I'm faced with temptation and persecution from the world, I'm going to stand. Even though it's hard, even though I want to sulk away into the corner, I'm going to stand. And as he looked to his mama, I'm going to look to the Lord. Because of the gospel. And it means that even if we suffer, no matter how many times life knocks us down, with a smile and a tenacity the world could never understand, we get back up. Because Jesus, through it all, went to that cross anyway. Because of the gospel. Live your life worthy of the gospel. If you're subject to an invitation tonight, we ask that you simply make whatever choice is needed. If you need to turn back to him, if you need to come to him for the first time, don't delay. Come right now as we stand and as we sing.